So I sat down to do my Fearful Symmetry Friday video last night, and it just got out of hand. It was too big in scope to complete last night, so I had to delay it until today. And one of the reasons for that is I'm going to be reading a larger chunk from Fearful Symmetry that meshes kind of well with this little bit from this video between N.T. Wright and Peter Thiel. This is a Veritas forum entitled "What is the Hope for Humanity? A Discussion of Technology, Politics, and Theology." So one of the interesting things that gets brought up is the tree of good and evil and the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. And it kind of reminded me of this section in Fearful Symmetry, the chapter 3 entitled Beyond Good and Evil, and specifically I'm going to read from part 2. And you're going to see some interesting connections here between Thiel, N.T. Wright, Jordan Peterson, Northrop, Frye, and William Blake.
That it's an issue with, well, I guess you can tell me what you think. If is the fundamental issue more structural, that we have sort of sclerotic bureaucracies and the FDA standing in people's way and all of that, or is there a more fundamental failure of imagination that's related to sort of where we've ended up because of how the religion and secularism dynamic has played out, how the 20th century played out, and so on?
I would say it's both. I think the structure.
Well, yes, okay.
I think the structure reflects
Right.
we tolerate the FDA because we don't really think we can have a cure for Alzheimer's. So what does it matter if the FDA stops every drug? We're not going to get a cure anyway, so it's okay. And then I think these things are both cause and effect. They sort of work on all these different levels. I agree with everything that Wright has said. With maybe one nuance. I think it is an open question how optimistic one could be. So I certainly think it is possible that one could be a lot more optimistic, and that there are sort of ways in which this is somewhat self-fulfilling. If you think something can't be done, it won't be done.
Yeah.
If you think it can be done, maybe you will help bring it about. And so there's this incredible self-fulfilling aspect to so much of it.
I plan to interrupt too often in this discussion that they're having, but there's a couple of interesting things here that I feel I have to point out. Notice how the interviewer there said it's a failure of imagination at how politics and religion and technology and science, they're all kind of playing out, sort of a passive attitude there. And the imagination would be what Blake would say is the active aspect of our perception of our human being. And this is tying into Jordan Peterson's explanation of how you perceive the world, that a tree stump could be a chair as well as anything else you can imagine it to be. There's the idea that there's a self-fulfilling prophecy, that you have to think something's possible in order for you to pursue it. That's sort of like the prerequisite, the presupposition that you have to have in your worldview. And if you go back to my human action, or human accomplishment rather, video series, this is something Charles Murray kind of touches on, that it was really Thomas Aquinas who had that famous quote that, science is okay because we are thinking the thoughts of God after him. So he gave the theological okay to pursue science. And the Christian worldview actually lays out an ordered world because there is a world creator who has a rational mind or a rational side to him. And N.T. Wright is going to later on quote this in support of that notion. Now they're going to diverge a little bit here, but it's interesting how they diverge and how they mix their views and takes on theology, philosophy, and so forth here.
It is possible that one could be a lot more optimistic, and that there are sort of ways in which this is somewhat self-fulfilling. If you think something can't be done, it won't be done.
Yeah.
If you think it can be done, maybe you will help bring it about. And so there's this incredible self-fulfilling aspect to so much of this.
Just a nuance, and it maybe this is the scholar's nervous twitch. I wouldn't myself use the word optimism, because that, it seems to me, describes an attitude, that some people are optimistic and some people are pessimistic. I would distinguish between optimism and hope. And hope is not simply an attitude that this is how I feel. Hope is something that says something has happened in history which gives me hope of something else that can happen and will happen. And the thing that's happened in history is to do with Jesus, to do with his resurrection, to do with a new world that's been launched, as a result of which, even when I'm feeling pessimistic, I still say I actually choose to believe that there is an ultimate hope, and because we live between those two, I choose to believe, even if I don't feel particularly optimistic about it, that there are things that I can do, that we can do right now to make the world a better place, to feed the hungry, to deal with diseases as best we can. Although it's part of the deal then that part of the optimism of the ultra-enlightenment, sort of uber-enlightenment, might be, have we got a cure for death itself? Can we actually move beyond that? And that's where the Enlightenment, I think, gets to the point of real arrogance of saying, well, the Christians had this myth about resurrection, whatever. We don't need that. We're going to make us live longer and longer and possibly forever. And it's an interesting sort of alternative, longevity as an alternative to a Christian hope.
This, I think, gets to, you know, one of the implicit themes of this conversation is that you could put back together, in some sense, the kind of scientific, questing, optimistic spirit and this, you know, or sort of reroot it in a kind of metaphysics of ultimate hope. But do you think, I mean, I think that, you know, I imagine you have some thoughts on this, because the question of life extension.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything incompatible with indefinite life extension and Christianity. I think in practice the question will never get framed that way. It will always be framed: do you want to cure cancer? Do you want to cure this type of disease or that sort of disease? So it's not like you're going to take this pill and you will live forever. So it's always going to be framed.
I'm pretty sure Ray Kurzweil was on my flight out here, so I don't know if
well, he thinks it will just happen automatically without people doing anything at all. So the singularity is near, just sit back and eat the popcorn. So that's not going to happen. But in practice, it will always get framed in terms of very specific questions. And
just wanted to make a note about Ray Kurzweil. I've also followed Ray for many years. In 1999, I bought his book, The Age of Spiritual Machines, and I sort of got entranced in how he laid out the, quote, facts. It's interesting to look at that book because in that book he has a timetable of predictions. And basically every about 10 years, I think, he lays out what he thinks the state of technology will be for humanity. And he makes some compelling arguments in books he has since published. The Singularity is Near is another one. I think that came out in 2006 or so. I'm not sure. But I'm not sure if he thinks it's automatically going to happen, as Peter Thiel says here, but I could see that perspective that Thiel's taking, that because one of the arguments Kurzweil makes, and one of the pieces of evidence he puts forward is that throughout very disruptive periods of history, the pace of technological change has not altered. And so he has various graphs in there, and I know you can manipulate statistics and stuff like that, but he also knows that, and he has various ways of making sure the graphs are straight. For example, you could cherry pick data points, and instead of him cherry picking data points, he has looked up what other people have listed as the other non-biased sources, and as the data points to use. And if you pick other people, even if you pick other people's data points, world wars have not disrupted technological change. Famines, the Great Depression, everything like that, stuff you really think would disrupt technological progression has in fact not disrupted it. So he makes some compelling arguments. I used to be a quite full believer in what Kurzweil was saying, and in the last couple of years, since reading more about Jordan Peterson and so forth, I've actually tempered my beliefs about the singularity, although I think it is somewhat inevitable, because it is part of human nature to pursue the ends of our imaginations. And while it might be difficult for China or a place like China that is more communistic to use their imaginations because they squash art, somewhere in the West, if the West is still surviving in the next 50 years, there will be a pursuit that will lead to the singularity. If you have no idea what that is, you don't have to worry about it, but it is just something I've been following closely, and I don't know, if you're into Peter Thiel, you might be following it too.
And I do think that both the hopeful and Christian And ethically correct answer is to always side on the side of, almost always on the side of, yeah, it would be good to have the cure for cancer or this other disease, and so on. And this is sort of a complicated intellectual history question. I think this would be very hard to sort out, but I do think this sort of idea of finding radically extending people's lives was part of the very early modern science project from the 17th and 18th century onwards. And I cannot help but wonder whether that was in part because of Christianity having said that that was a possibility. And so if you lived in a world where people said, death is natural, it's just what happens to everybody, then that would not have been a realistic goal. But if you, and this was certainly not part of, say, Greek science in the 5th century BC. There was no Francis Bacon who wrote as though something like this was conceivable.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm not sure that it was ever part of a Christian agenda, because the Christian agenda always was resurrection, and which, if properly understood, would be resurrection not into some fluffy non-spatiotemporal heaven, but into actually a new world, a God making new heavens and new earth. But it seems to me, if people are saying that this is something which is now possible, something which is now conceivable, it seems to me more likely that what they're saying is we Christians have had a tradition of curing diseases as best we can and of working medically. And of course we have to remind ourselves that until the middle and late 19th century, the average life expectancy for a reasonably healthy adult man or woman was in the 40s or 50s rather than 60s, 70s, 80s. So that in a sense, it's been already remarkably successful that a lot of people who in generations gone by would have been dead by the time they were my age, mid-60s, are still, well, here we are, still here, living proof that something's happened. So I don't see there's anything wrong in saying we could actually increase that, but the point at which it treads into dangerous territory, it seems to me, would be to imagine a sort of elixir of life, as you say, a magic pill, something which sounds rather like what was in the Garden of Eden and wasn't allowed to be taken.
But I guess the question would be, is that a...
Go ahead.
No, well, it strikes me that, one sort of, we're getting near to the point where we'll segue into questions and answers, but one sort of pointed question I would put to you is, in a sense, does entrepreneurship, does science need religion? But as a corollary to that, it seems, again, as an outsider sort of observing the culture of Northern California, Silicon Valley, and so on from the outside, there does seem to be an extent to which that narrative, to the extent that anything is filling the void left by the collapse of religious belief, it is a sort of quasi-religious vision of the singularity, of sort of indefinite life expectancy and so on, that's untethered from any metaphysic, but is sort of promising something that religion used to deliver.
Well, let's see. I don't want to get into. I suspect very dangerous to get into a theological debate here, but I think in the Garden of Eden, if I recall, there were two trees. There was the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they weren't supposed to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Tree of life was not forbidden.
But it subsequently was after they, yeah.
But not in the original conception.
Sure.
Again, I just want to add something that's related to this. I don't think N.T. Wright mentions it. He may. It's been a while since I watched this video. I had to rewatch it last night. But what was interesting about the myth that the Jews had about this Garden of Eden, what made it somewhat different from the surrounding myths, is that they were not exclusively pursuing the tree of life. It was eternal life that a lot of these religions were always after, not presupposing that it was necessarily going to be able to be had, but that it was somehow out there, and if they could just get it, they could. So the tree of life is in the Garden of Eden, so it's there, the human beings have access to it, but it was the tree of good and evil that sort of made the big difference. That was not something that those other civilizations necessarily thought about the way the Jews did. And so it sort of distinguished their myth from the surrounding myths.
And so I think there is this question whether one thinks of death as simply a natural part of life. And you know, every myth on this planet tells us that all that lives must die, to kind of quote Hamlet's evil mother. And we sort of rationalize death in one form or another. And I think the notion that death is unnatural, that it's this sort of fallen or flawed or very screwed up condition in which we find ourselves, that's not a pagan view, that is a Christian view. And so I don't think it was part of the agenda of science or Christian agenda to do this, but I think it was not surprising that it emerged in the sort of world where people thought that was possible.
But do you think that idea, unmoored from a metaphysical hope, could be sufficient to sort of sustain or create a rebirth of the kind of optimism that you think American society needs? And then I'll have a, yeah.
Yeah, I'm always skeptical of metaphysics. I think the thing that is striking on the sort of transhumanist versus Christian thing is how similar they are. And so I think you can sort of point to metaphysical differences, but the thing that sort of is always striking is you're going to have a transformed body. You know, there's going to be this radical transformation of the way everything works. There will be no more random freak accidents that happen to kill you. And so I think it's actually the similarities that are striking, and then one shouldn't try to overlay some metaphysical difference.
And is this not because, I mean, a lot of early science, and by early science I don't mean the Greeks or the Egyptians, I mean early modern science in the 16th, 17th century, grew out of a Christian celebration of the goodness of creation. And the old phrase used to be that science was thinking God's thoughts after him, and it wasn't science or religion, it was science grew out of a Christian faith, a Christian exploration. But what's happened since, and again particularly since the Enlightenment, is, and this has happened on several issues. I mean, the previous Pope said in a speech at the United Nations that with regard to human rights, what's happened since the 18th century is that human rights, which really grew out of a Christian vision of what it meant to be human, how you should treat your neighbor, etc., that's been cut off from its Christian roots, and it's now been made into a kind of independent, freestanding entity, which then is getting you into all sorts of areas where every possible pressure group claims this is my right, these are our rights, and it's impossible to get past the shouting match between these competing rights because we've cut it off from its roots.
Again, this is in 2014, and you will hear Jordan talking about similar things right now in 2018.
Might it not be possible that the same thing has happened with science, that science, having grown out of a faith-based exploration of the world, Jewish and Christian and Muslim actually, because if you're a creational monotheist, there is always this sense of delight and exploration in creation. But then when science cuts itself off from that, kicks God upstairs and says, we now have this progress thing which is just taking us where we need to go. So then you get the archetypal mad scientist or the Frankenstein maker or whatever, and confusion about rights. It's been cut off from its original roots. Would there be, if that's A, is that the right analysis, and B, if that's so, would it be healthy to explore ways of putting science and Christian faith back together again, not by going back to the 17th century, but by going on to a different way of conceiving it?
I think, look, I think there is a point where people overdo science and technology. I think there aren't very many people who do that in our society. So I think, you know, the Frankenstein novel by Mary Wollstonecraft was semi-autobiographical because her father was involved in a variety of these sorts of experiments, and so it was sort of like, and you know, I have a preference for her father over the rebellious daughter who was not, you know, not honoring her parents, and who, and you know, and we are living in this, you know, and you know, I do think I think there's something about the Faustian ambition of Goethe that's maybe a little bit screwed up, but then, you know, the alternative, you know, is I think it is better than the sort of Nietzschean alternative. I always think of Nietzsche as sort of the first environmental philosopher who rejected both Christianity and the scientific technological utopia and sort of willed a return to nature, to sort of a counterfeit Eden bared red in tooth and claw.
Yeah. But Nietzsche quite wrongly, I think, saw Christianity as, in his phrase, Platonism for the masses. That this was a way of getting a spirituality that would leave the philosophical academic halls and be available to everyone. And I think that was a radical mistake on Nietzsche's part, because Christianity was never a form of Platonism, because Platonism is precisely a dualistic framework which says that this present world doesn't matter that much, and ideally you inhabit another world already, and you will one day inhabit it completely. That's what people have done with Christianity. To that extent, Nietzsche, I think, was right, but that isn't what original Christianity, Jesus and Paul and so on, was all about. And I think the task then would be not to say we agree with Nietzsche's critique, because there were all sorts of odd things about it, but to say we need to get back to a more robust, holistic, heaven and earth together, faith and science together, way of looking at the world. One of the great commentators in Britain at the moment is the former chief rabbi, Jonathan Sacks. I don't know if you've worked with him at all, but he's an amazing man. He wrote a book called The Great Partnership recently about science and faith, and I was thinking about that in the light of this, and he says, science takes things apart to see how they work, religion puts things together to see what they mean. So you see, that's a sign of a great partnership. And okay, it's an oversimplification, and he knows that, but I think there's something enormously important there.
See, that's what Ian McGilchrist is also working on. That's sort of his project with the Master and his Emissary, the making of the modern world and the division of the brain and so forth. And it sort of mirrors Jordan Peterson's work, and I think Jordan Peterson was able to popularize, given his charisma and the way he talks about things and his little foibles, he was able to popularize some of these ideas. And that's a good thing. I think when the person you're into, the garage band, let's say, starts to get famous and they start to move away from their roots and their musical tradition, of course it's disappointing, but are they bringing some kind of message to a greater number of people, and is it still essentially the same message? I think that's what Jordan Peterson is doing right now, but only time will tell what ultimately happens. Like, how far away from his message is he going to get? I'm actually going to make a smaller, shorter video about that instead of nesting it inside this one.
But what you're talking about is so much not science as in, and maybe this is an important distinction we haven't made, not science as in, let's take it apart to see how it works, as in, let's think of something else that we might be able to do, see what it would take to make that work. In other words, to go forward in not just exploration and description, but actually innovation and development.
I agree that there's something very screwed up with Cartesianism, and I think to sort of concretize this a little bit, I would say one could say that the last 40 years we've had a Cartesian economy, a dualistic economy in which there was enormous progress on the level of information and bits, but not on the level of matter and atoms. And so, and in some ways, again, from a sort of libertarian perspective, I would argue the government did not regulate bits and it outlawed atoms. And so, so there was a regulatory reason for this. But we've had this sort of Cartesian economy in which we've had enormous progress in bits, not very much in atoms. And that's probably been inadequate, because the reality is that we are material beings in a material world. And that's why it's one of the reasons I think technology has been more, information technology alone has not been enough to create the better world people were promised.
So it's time now to go to questions. I would say that we've...
So that's where I'm going to end the Peter Thiel and N.T. Wright discussion as far as my Fearful Symmetry Fridays video is concerned. They talk about many more interesting things, which I may or may not comment on further down the line. But right now, I'd like to start on Chapter 3 in Fearful Symmetry, which is Northrop Frye's study of William Blake. And Chapter 3 is entitled Beyond Good and Evil, and I'm reading from Section 2. And like I said, this is relevant if you're interested in Jordan Peterson, because Northrop Frye was someone who heavily influenced him, and William Blake was someone who heavily influenced Northrop Frye. So we're kind of seeing the degrees of separation here. But normally I would like to only quote a short passage from Fearful Symmetry, at most maybe a couple of pages. But this is going to be a much lengthier quotation, because I think it fits too well with this video and with things that are going on right now. So here we go. Tyranny is the cooperation of parasite and host. No tyrant maintains himself by force, but by trading on his victim's fears. So although, quote, a tyrant is the worst disease and the cause of all others, the tyrant can at any rate be seen, and the imagination can handle anything that can be seen. It is the sense of the indefinite unseen, acquired by turning away from perception, which is capable of restraining imagination, and as, quote, everybody hates a king, end quote, he would soon be destroyed if there were no sense of a mysterious power lurking behind him, if, in short, there were no divinity to hedge the king. Tyranny requires a priesthood and a god first, and these make it permanent. Religion has been called the opiate of the people, but religion in its conventionally accepted and socially established form is far more dangerous than any opiate, the effects of which are transitory. As long as we ascribe the real source of tyranny to temporal power, we may overthrow that power only to find that it has attached itself to the new government, and we have to begin all over again. As Paul said in the passage Blake took as a motto for the 4 Zoas, quote, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." End quote. There is only one false religion, as there is only one true one. And it has 2 infallible marks. First, it postulates some kind of God who is unknown and mysterious because he is not inside us, but somewhere else, where only God knows. Second, it preaches submission, acceptance, and unquestioning obedience. The sting is in the tail. Religion of this kind, being invented only to buttress the status quo, it is always, quote, state religion, which is the source of all cruelty, end quote. This is seen in its clearest form in the worship of a deified Caesar, but subtler tyrants have preferred various kinds of loyal disguise. Blake says, for instance, of Bacon's essays, quote, "Everybody knows that this is Epicureanism and libertinism, and yet everybody says that it is Christian philosophy. How is this possible? Everybody must be a liar and deceiver. No, everybody, quote, everybody, does not do this, but the hirelings of kings and courts, who made themselves, quote, everybody, and knowingly propagate falsehood." Now, just to interject, some Owen Benjamin fans may believe that that is what Jordan Peterson is doing. He's making himself everybody, and he is propagating falsehoods. But again, I've already said my piece on that, and you can decide for yourself. Back to Northrop Frye's fearful symmetry. Besides, the anti-imaginative structure must be made as complete as possible, for the imagination is always finding holes in it. In fact, it is always finding it transparent. As that same Bacon remarked, truth comes more easily from error than from confusion. It is the business of imagination to force all falsehood into a denial of truth, to show error as error, to clarify it by reducing the neutral ground. False or state religion has thus altered its forms in the course of centuries, not because it is capable in itself of any development, but because it has had to meet the increasing comprehensiveness of the imagination which has followed the work of the prophets and Jesus. We have already seen how Blake regarded deism as a consolidation of error, which indicated an imminent final rejection of it. In the unfallen world, objects of perception are alive and intelligent, and a faint echo of the animation of that world survives in the animism of primitive religion. The nymphs, satyrs, and fauns of classical mythology are older and more authentic than the Olympian hierarchy. With the separation of existence and perception, however, the natural object became attached to the latter, and its spirit or genius to the former, so that gradually a belief in invisible deities grew up. The 11th plate of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, the paragraph beginning, quote, "The ancient poets animated all sensible objects with gods or geniuses," end quote, traces this process with a clarity that might impress even a modern student of the subject. If you don't know, he's referencing The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. That's one of William Blake's more popular works. In the later poems, Blake contrasts the fairies of the more original belief with the heathen gods, who succeeded them. These gods were invariably selfish and cruel, as a god whose interests do not run counter to those of man cannot be invoked in support of a tyranny. Ovid shows them particularly interested in stifling and suppressing the artists who attempted to rival them, i.e. create better gods, as in the stories of Marsyas and Arachne. It is in the god of official Christianity, however, invented as a homeopathic cure for the teachings of Jesus, that state religion has produced its masterpiece. This God is good, and we are evil. Yet, though he created us, he is somehow or other not responsible for our being evil, though he would consider it blasphemous either to assert that he is, or to deny his omnipotence. All calamities and miseries are his will, and to that will we must absolutely resign, even in thought and desire. The powers that be are ordained of him, and all might is divine right. The visions of artists and prophets are of little importance to him. He did not ordain those, but an invariable ritual and a set of immovable dogmas, which are more in keeping with his ideas of order. Both of these are deep mysteries, to be entrusted to a specially initiated class of servants. He keeps a grim watch over everything men do, and will finally put most of them in hell to scream eternally in torment, eternally meaning, of course, endlessly in time. A few, however, who have done as they have been told, that is, have done nothing creative, will be granted an immortality of the, quote, pie in the sky when you die variety. It is easy to call this popular misunderstanding, but perhaps harder to deny that Orthodox religion is founded on a compromise with it. If God moves in mysterious ways, a mysterious God may be capable of anything, and as all mysteries are nightmares, this one increases in horror the longer we continue to think of what he may do to us. But as only the worst of men would torture other men in hell endlessly, given the power, those who believe God does this worship the devil, or the worst elements in man. And this devil takes his duties as prince of this world very seriously. In practice, he is far worse than his most devoted admirer would dare admit. In practice, all established churches are irrevocably committed to the defense of their establishment, and any time of crisis shows clearly that, as far as the Orthodox are concerned, quote, God is only an allegory of kings, and nothing else. God is the ghost of the priest and king who exist, whereas God exists not except from their effluvia, end quote. In early days, this God had a hankering for human blood, for he would naturally regard suicide or murder as the most reverent homage that could be paid to him. The Old Testament shows him grudgingly retiring under pressure of the prophets and being forced to content himself with murdered animals, but the feeling that human sacrifice is the ultimate gesture of respect still persists, and periodically causes holy wars and crusades. This creature, Blake calls, outside the prophecies, quote, Old Nobodaddy. And here he is, contemplating the French Revolution. Quote, The king awoke on his couch of gold. As soon as he heard these tidings told, then he swore a great solemn oath, To kill the people I am loath, but if they rebel, they must go to hell, and they shall have a priest and a passing bell. Then old Nobodaddy aloft farted and belched and coughed, and said, I love hanging and drawing and quartering, every bit as well as war and slaughtering. Damn praying and singing, unless they will bring in the blood of 10,000 by fighting or swinging. Although this God is personal, there is a recurrent tendency to think of him as impersonal. He constantly relapses into fate or necessity as soon as his pretensions are examined at all seriously. Being a mere shadow of the tyrant's demand, that we submit passively to him whatever we think or want to do, and not having any more intelligible program of obedience, even the 10 Commandments only tell us what we must not do. Although I think you can argue about that. Nobodaddy turns out to be much like our old friend the immanent will, capital W. Perfect obedience to him would be unconscious and automatic, like the circling of the stars. The believers in him tell us that the whole universe obeys God in this way except us, and that we do not because we are evil and have fallen. Well, so we have. But the fatal mistake in orthodox thought comes at the next step. all good comes from God, and as the Orthodox say, God is not man, man must be, quote, simple and yet capable of evil, end quote. Such a man must, therefore, look, quote, beyond the human world for salvation. And there is nothing beyond the human world except the spatial beyond, which is nature, and which suggests all these ideas of uncritical docility. Hence routine and passive life comes to be thought good. All that is independent, free, and energetic comes to be associated with evil. This exaltation of the routine and the passive is congenial to all forms of fatalism, among which Blake puts predestination, because they assert that we are not to do what we can in this world, but what we must. The same idea is enforced in society by law. Law at its best is impartial. It assumes equality among all men, and so exactly corresponds to the equality of dullness which asserts that only the guinea sun can, quote, really be seen. Now, another interjection, if you're not familiar with the whole guinea sun thing, I do go over it early on in the Fearful Symmetry series. It's briefly, William Blake described the sun in the sky not to be a mere golden disk like a gold coin, the guinea, held up, but rather as a choir of heavenly angels singing the praises of God. So he had an imaginative vision of what the sun was. In other words, it puts normality at the lower limits, just as Lockean philosophy does. Every real thing contains within it its unique law of growth and coherence, and hence, quote, one law for the lion and ox is oppression, end quote. Just as one idea of proportion to cover them both is nonsense. A generalizing law permits of no exceptions, but everything that lives is an exception to it. Penal laws are based on the assumption that the general interest must be preserved, and preserved by compulsion. Therefore they, quote, court transgression, end quote. The worship of mediocrity goes much farther than this. Greek ethics, for instance, is based on a hesitation and diffidence, which is designed not to alter social conditions. Blake wrote such aphorisms as, quote, the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom, end quote, with one eye on the Greek, quote, nothing in excess, end quote. Prudence is defined by Blake as, quote, a rich, ugly old maid courted by incapacity, end quote. And in the prophecies he speaks of the four classical virtues as the four pillars of Satan's throne. But official Christianity is no better. It too tells us that humility and modesty are great virtues, and that in exalting oneself above a certain level there is grave danger. For anything that might attract the attention of the Setbos god it worships is sure to exasperate him. This corresponds to the experimental scientist's teaching that we should reserve judgment and not commit ourselves to anything until we are sure of being well within the guinea sun conception of reality. Hence Blake says not only, quote, if the sun and moon should doubt, they'd immediately go out, but also, humility is only doubt, and does the sun and moon blot out. All moral virtue of this kind ends in lugubrious and portentous dullness. If such a morality were based on nothing more than expediency, it would be bad enough, but at least it would relate only to particular actions. This uncomplicated denial of imagination might, however, expose its reactionary basis a little too clearly. It is safer to fall back on the original point that all good is from God and all evil from man, that the former is symbolized by routine obedience and the latter by independence. When this idea is pressed a little, it becomes obvious that all activity is really evil, and hence the passive and inert is the good. We are back again at the idea of negative perfection. A negatively perfect God, we said, a God who is pure goodness, can do nothing. A negatively perfect man is in the same dilemma. As an interjection here, I do go over this in my Fearful Symmetry series early on, and I think this sort of relates to my video, Jordan's 13th rule, plow the shit. Now, I'll continue now. Everything that lives is holy, end quote. And as long as we equate good and evil with life and death, the words mean something. But adjusting one's life to a normal level of the kind recommended by moral virtue is no more, quote, good than any other form of fashionable self-mutilation, such as foot binding or waist pinching. The morally good man tries to obey an external God instead of bringing out the God in himself. The external God being only the shadow of Caesar, the good man finds himself obeying the latter instead. Caesar being only the shadow of popular timidity, the good man finds himself in the end doing what everyone else does. Morality as such is slave morality. That is what the Bible means when it says that while man was in Eden, he possessed the tree of life, but when he turned to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he found that he had the tree of death. Quote, "By this it will be seen that I do not consider either the just or the wicked to be in a supreme state, but to be every one of them states of the sleep which the soul may fall into in its deadly dreams of good and evil, when it leaves paradise following the serpent. The combats of good and evil is eating of the tree of knowledge. The combats of truth and error is eating of the tree of life." End quote. The conception of the saving power of God, held by Orthodox Christians, would be correct if it were not worked out in terms of an antithesis of divine and human wills, rather than a unity of divine and human imagination. Quote, "If man," Blake asks, "is considered as only evil and God only good, how then is regeneration effected, which turns the evil to good?" End quote. The power of becoming our own best selves must be within us. There can be no oracles to approach and no incantations to memorize. Satan in the Bible is called Diabolos, or accuser, because he is forever reminding man of his own insufficiency and causing him to despair of deliverance, and his henchmen spread throughout society the state of mind called by Blake the, quote, "accusation of sin," end quote, the final triumph of the death impulse, the complete torpor and paralysis of the mind. For Satan is not himself a sinner, but a self-righteous prig. As Blake explains, quote, "We do not find anywhere that Satan is accused of sin. He is only accused of unbelief, and thereby drawing man into sin, that he may accuse him, end quote. As long as God is conceived as a bloodthirsty bully, this priggishness takes the form of persecution and heresy hunting as a service acceptable to him. But we saw that under examination, old Nobodaddy soon vanishes into a mere perpetual motion machine of causation, and as deism is an isolation of what is abstract and generalized in Christianity, Satan in Blake's day has become a deist, and has turned to subtler forms of persecution, to ridicule and shoulder-shrugging, and pointing out contemptuously how little evidence there is for any kind of reality except that of natural law. Yet deism professed to be part of a revolutionary force. The American and French revolutions were largely deist-inspired, and both appeared to Blake to be genuinely imaginative upheavals. He wrote poems warmly sympathizing with both, hoping that they were the beginning of a worldwide revolt that would begin his apocalypse. He met and liked Tom Paine, and respected his honesty as a thinker, yet Paine could write in the Age of Reason, quote, "I had some turn, and I believe some talent for poetry, but this I rather repressed than encouraged, as leading too much into the field of imagination." The attitude to life implied by such a remark can have no permanent revolutionary vigor, for underlying it is the weary materialism which asserts that the deader a thing is, the more trustworthy it is, that a rock is a solid reality, and that the vital spirit of a living man is a rarefied and diaphanous ghost. It is no accident that Paine should say in the same book that God can be revealed only in mechanics, and that a mill is a microcosm of the universe. A revolution based on such ideas is not an awakening of the spirit of man. If it kills a tyrant, it can only replace him with another, as the French Revolution swung from Bourbon to Bonaparte. But if it abolishes tyrants altogether, it can only do so by establishing a tyranny of custom so powerful that the tyrant will not be necessary, as in the Ant Republic. An inadequate mental attitude toward liberty can think of it only as a leveling out. Democracy of this sort is a placid ovine herd of self-satisfied mediocrities. Blake watched this tendency growing as he became more disillusioned with the French and American revolutions, and at the end of his life he was still protesting, quote, "But since the French Revolution, Englishmen are all intermeasurable by one another, certainly a happy state of agreement, in which I, for one, do not agree." The difference between the deist and the Blakean ideas of a free and democratic society corresponds again to the difference between the Guinea sun and the angelic sun. In deism, there is not only the belief that the physical world is the only real one, but also a feeling of satisfaction at remaining within it, a certain enthusiasm about accepting the conditions it imposes. Now it seems reasonable enough to take the world as we find it, trying to be as contented in it as possible, and make others so, without straining after more elusive pleasures, perhaps less substantial ones. But if it were possible to do this, the human race would have settled into utopian serenity centuries ago. It remains true that the physical world is not good enough for the imagination to accept, and if we do accept it, we are left with our selfhoods, our verminous crawling egos that spend all their time either wronging others or brooding on wrongs done to them. The end of all natural religion, however well-meaning and good-natured, is a corrupt and decadent society rolling downhill to stampeding mass hysteria and maniacal warfare. This is the historical succession to deism, which Blake in Jerusalem symbolizes as Druidism, for reasons to be explained in due course. If there is greater imaginative power in the revolutionary impulse, it is not so much because of what it accomplishes as because of what it is in itself. Revolution is always an attempt to smash the structure of tyranny and create a better world, even when revolutionaries do not understand what creation implies or what a better world is. The apocalypse will necessarily begin with a slaughter of tyrants, and Christ came, Blake says, to deliver those bound under the knave, not to deliver the knave. Later on, we shall trace in greater detail the waning of Blake's interest in the revolutionary movements of his time. All we need to say just now is that for Blake, the central problem of social and political liberty is the release of imagination. Hence the initial stage in attaining this, for Blake as for Milton before him, and for Carlyle and others after him, is to establish the role of the great man in society. The goal of prophecy is the Messiah, the divine man. This involves the question of the nature of the great man. We shall see later why to Blake the great man can only be the visionary prophetic artist, never the Carlylean hero or the Nietzschean Superman. Society is best off when it is sufficiently aware of its own defects to let the prophet scold it, and the honest man say what he likes. And I'm going to move on just a little bit into section 3 as well, because I think there's some more important bits here. Therefore, the real war in society is the, quote, mental fight between the visionaries and the champions of tyranny. The latter are not the tyrants themselves, but visionary renegades, poets like Virgil who write for Caesar, philosophers who, quote, teach doubt and experiment, end quote, generalizing painters like Titian and Rubens, theological apologists of Nobodaddy. As they are guardians of society and moral virtue, Blake calls them angels. For those who, like himself, call the whole structure of society in question, there is no word but devils. Angels, though wrong, are essential to imagination for the reason given above, that the basis of tyranny is not error but confusion. Those who really believe in tyranny and work out a coherent defense of it clarify confusion into error, and thereby demonstrate its opposite to be true. The uses to society of the devil and the angel, Blake says, are about equal, because, quote, to be an error and to be cast out is a part of God's design, end quote. Hence there must be in society a continuous fight between radical and conservative imagination. Quote, without contraries is no progression, end quote. But this is the only kind of contrariety that can progress. Blake, in dealing with the artists he considers angels, lays about him with the destructive fury of a Friar John, without stopping to think whether he is being unfair to them or not. They can take care of themselves. Blake is engaged in, quote, intellectual war. He thinks of his state of Eden as an eternal Valhalla of conflicts waged with bows of burning gold and arrows of desire. But attacking angels is only part of the prophet's work. Another part is concerned with the conquering of neutrals. These are not strong enough to fight because they are victims of revenge morality. For those who live under the curse of the law see in every vigorous act the uncompleted half of a movement toward inertia, to be followed and neutralized at once by its opposite. Hence revenge or attack comes to be a typical response to activity, and as retribution tends to be neutralizing of activity, Retribution is not only bad in itself, but a waste of time. Wars, penal codes, and persecutions never become positive acts, and while they will always exist as long as the world is fallen, they are never more than the endless working out of a decimal proved millenniums ago to be recurring. So that's the quite bit of a lengthy quote from Fearful Symmetry. I hope you see all the relevance going on in today's world with Jordan Peterson, with this bit about N.T. Wright and Peter Thiel that I added to this video. The deism, Epicureanism, the new atheist movement, what liberty and freedom require, Jordan's infamous tweet. All of this stuff is sort of entangled together, and the process of entanglement has been going on for hundreds of years now, and we're all active players in this. And if you like this sort of thing, again, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.
Well, there's a guy who's got a little YouTube channel, and I've been sending a lot of people his way, Node in a Network, and he's basically been reading all of the stuff in the footnotes of Maps of Meaning,
where we're all sort of plugged in as like nodes on the network.
Node in a network, there's a good username.
A node in a network.
The wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network.